During the most tense years of the Cold War, Moscow was more than a city. It was a perfect trap. Its streets, wrapped in fog and silence, breathed suspicion. Every corner had ears, every window could hide a camera, and every conversation, no matter how innocent, could be the last mistake of a spy. Foreign hotels were riddled with microphones. Taxi drivers reported to the KGB. Even the elevator operators knew more than they would ever dare to say. In Moscow, the very air belonged to the state. 4 Western intelligence agencies operating there was like trying to light a match underwater. The KGB controlled everything: movements, communications, faces. Their surveillance was so complete that even diplomats knew they were being watched in their dreams. And yet, the impossible happened. Amid the echo of footsteps on frozen streets, a small group of men and women crossed the threshold of fear. They were CIA agents who managed to infiltrate the very heart of Moscow without the Soviet beast ever noticing. They weren't soldiers. They carried no weapons or uniforms. Their strength lay in ingenuity, patience, and silence. Their mission wasn't just to steal secrets. It was to prove that even in the bear's den, the West could still move unseen. For months, they operated under the nose of the KGB, moving invisible pieces across a board where a single mistake meant certain death. Every step defied logic. Every meeting was a duel between paranoia and audacity. This is the story of the boldest operation the CIA ever carried out inside Moscow. A feat of espionage so daring that for decades it was denied, classified, erased from every official record. But the archives open eventually, and shadows, sooner or later, always reveal the truth. By the late 1970s, Moscow was the heart of darkness, a city where the snow fell over a silence carefully controlled, and every shadow could hide an agent of the KGB. Nowhere on Earth was surveillance so absolute. More than 20,000 KGB officers were dedicated exclusively to tracking, listening to, and recording the movements of foreigners. Nothing escaped their eyes. Hotel ceilings were filled with microphones. Mirrors were fake, lamps concealed transmitters, and waiters knew more about diplomacy than the ambassadors they served. For Western agents, walking through Moscow was like crossing a minefield of suspicion. The Americans had a name for it: the Moscow Rules, an unwritten code separating life from death. Assume you're always being watched. Trust no one, not even your allies. If you're caught, no one is coming to save you. The CIA knew it well, and yet the risk was unavoidable. By 1977, spy satellites had detected strange activity at Soviet bases near Plesetsk and Saryshaghan. The signs were clear. The USSR was developing a new anti-missile system, one capable of destroying U.S. nuclear warheads before they reached their targets. Washington needed answers, and they needed them from inside the Kremlin itself. Photos, schematics, frequencies, names, everything. And no satellite or aerial scan could deliver that. Only a man or woman on the ground could. The problem was that entering Moscow on a covert mission was like stepping into the wolf's mouth. American diplomats were shadowed from Sheremetyevo Airport to their apartments. Every phone call was recorded. Every conversation was analyzed by KGB psychologists and intelligence experts. But in the gray corridors of Langley, someone made a decision that bordered on madness: to send a special CIA team directly into Moscow. A small group, without official cover, without local allies, and with the order to operate completely under the KGB's radar. Their objective was simple on paper, but impossible in practice: to obtain hard evidence of Soviet ballistic missile advancements. They didn't know it yet, but what they were about to attempt would change the history of espionage forever. The operation was born under a code name that sounded more like a stage play than an act of war: Prologue. Behind that cold bureaucratic label lay something far more human and far more unsettling: a man living 2 lives. At first glance, Tony Mendez was just a communications technician at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. An ordinary face, skilled hands, and a calm, polite smile. But beneath that appearance lived someone trained to become a different person every day. He had mastered accents, gestures, forged signatures, and the subtle art of vanishing into his surroundings. He wasn't a movie hero. He was a craftsman of deception, an artist whose work demanded patience, steady nerves, and the acceptance that any encounter could be his last. Mendez didn't act alone. He assembled a small team, men and women chosen not for bravado, but for their self-control, their precision under pressure, and above all, their willingness to accept a life without recognition. The mission demanded not just courage, but imagination. They had to make the visible invisible. The CIA understood that technology alone couldn't win this game. What truly set the operation apart was human creativity, the ability to turn routine into cover, to make the enemy's habits work against them. Mendez exploited the KGB's bureaucracy, its predictability, and its overconfidence. He designed operations that seemed almost absurd in their simplicity, and that was precisely why they worked. The team trained relentlessly. Simulations in freezing rooms, mock exchanges in crowded parks, nerve tests in taxis whose drivers had no idea they were part of an intelligence exercise. They didn't just learn to survive Moscow. They learned to read it, which alleys provided escape routes, which windows bounced sound away from microphones, which cafes drowned a whisper in the hum of conversation. Meetings with sources became choreographed dances. A gesture, a briefcase placed on a bench, a phrase spoken under breath. Each act had to appear meaningless to a casual observer. The network of contacts grew slowly. A factory technician who talked too much, a receptionist who didn't notice enough, a taxi driver with a long memory. Each connection was both a risk and an opportunity. Maintaining their trust required codes, subtle tests of loyalty, and a silent promise that if everything went right, their names would never be spoken aloud. Nights in Moscow turned into quiet chess matches. One agent waiting in shadow while another crossed an avenue at rush hour, both moving only when absolutely necessary. There were moments when the tension became unbearable. A car that passed twice down the same street. A stare held a moment too long. A policeman adjusting his cap at the wrong time. In those seconds, breathing itself became a weapon, slow, measured, almost invisible. And, as with all high-risk operations, there was improvisation and loss. One contact vanished without explanation. Another grew too bold and spoke too freely. But Mendez's ingenuity and his team's discipline paid off. They managed to gather fragments of intelligence that, at first glance, seemed trivial, but when pieced together, revealed a map of Soviet military activity that no satellite could provide. By the end of that period, the operation had proven something few thought possible. The KGB did not control everything. In a city once thought impenetrable, the West had learned to move, not through strength, but through patience, cunning, and the quiet courage of those who knew anonymity was the only reward. What they didn't yet know was that their success, built on such fragile ice, would come with a price. Because in the world of shadows, victory never goes unpunished. The ultimate goal of the operation was as ambitious as it was suicidal: to establish contact with a Soviet colonel who had decided to betray the very system he had served all his life. His code name was Trigon, though, to the Kremlin, he was nothing more than another faceless bureaucrat within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. No one suspected that behind his glasses and calm demeanor walked the most valuable informant the CIA had ever placed inside the Soviet Union. Trigon was neither an idealist nor a spy for money. He was a man who had seen too much: internal purges, official lies, families destroyed by the machinery of fear. His motivation was more moral than political. He wanted to balance the scales, to reveal to the world what was happening behind the Iron Curtain before it was too late. The first contact took place on a rainy night, in an alley near Gorky Park. A hidden camera inside a cigarette box, a flash of light from a nearby apartment window, and a small package placed beneath a park bench. That was how a collaboration began that would haunt Soviet intelligence for years to come. Nothing was ever spoken aloud. Messages traveled in microfilms hidden inside coins, in 35mm negatives, in seemingly ordinary letters written with invisible ink. Each exchange was a flawless choreography performed under the constant gaze of the KGB. And yet, it worked. For months, the CIA and Trigon exchanged secrets that should never have left the Kremlin. Documents detailing missile deployments, satellite communication codes, and internal reports on Soviet military readiness. The information he provided reshaped Washington's entire understanding of Soviet power. And all of it happened within sight of the enemy. But soon, the city began to smell betrayal. The KGB, obsessed with finding a leak, started noticing patterns. A rescheduled meeting, a misplaced package, a shadow that crossed the same street twice. Moscow was a wounded beast, and it had caught the scent of blood. Mendez's agents moved with hearts pounding in their chests. Surveillance teams multiplied, apartments were raided as a precaution, and telephones rang with long, ominous silences on the other end. They knew the network was doomed, but not when or how it would fall. And then one day, Trigon vanished. He never showed up at his drop point. The microfilm container remained untouched beneath the park bench. The communication channels went dark one by one. Weeks later, the news spread quietly. The colonel had been arrested. His interrogation lasted for days. Declassified documents reveal that he remained steadfast, denying everything until the very end. His final words were simple and haunting. Don't blame them. They tried to save me. For the CIA, it was a devastating blow. A brilliant operation, engineered to perfection, undone by a single misplaced word at the wrong moment. But the KGB never discovered that the most valuable intelligence had already left the country, hidden inside a diplomatic container weeks before his capture. In that invisible war, there were no clean victories, only silence, loss, and the faint comfort of having bought the world a little more time. When a network began to crumble, Tony Mendez knew that time had run out. In the silent war of espionage, there is no redemption for those who stay behind. Only one rule remains. If you're discovered, disappear. The final protocol was activated on a winter night, under snowfall that seemed to erase every trace of what had happened. The CIA agents in Moscow, technicians, diplomats, drivers, even a secretary who was actually a cryptography expert, moved within hours. Every classified document was reduced to ashes. Every microfilm destroyed. Every identity rewritten. Their real names were sealed in envelopes back in Langley. In Moscow, only shadows remained. Mendez, true to his craft, had prepared exits no one could imagine. Makeshift corridors between embassies, falsified diplomatic passports, and official vehicles that, under the cover of immunity, crossed Soviet checkpoints without inspection. In the days that followed, the KGB unleashed an unprecedented manhunt. They searched hotels, apartments, garages, even the trash bins of the diplomatic district. The entire city became a web of traps. But when Soviet agents finally stormed what they believed to be the CIA's operational hub, they found nothing but dust, smoke, and the echo of silence. No traces, no fingerprints, no one. For weeks, the Kremlin demanded explanations from Washington. American diplomats smiled and denied everything. Espionage in Moscow, they said, is a Western fantasy. But the truth was different. The CIA had executed one of the most precise, rapid, and flawless operations of the entire Cold War. They had entered the enemy's heart, taken what they needed, and vanished, as if they had never existed. For years, the KGB refused to admit the blow. Too humiliating, too perfect. Until, in 1993, the archives began to open. And among yellowed pages, an internal document signed by a senior Soviet officer admitted the unthinkable. The Americans were here, and we didn't see them coming. In a war where power was measured in secrets, Mendez and his team not only survived, they proved that even in the enemy's heart, cunning could be stronger than fear. The infiltration of Moscow was more than just an espionage operation. It was a deep wound to the pride of the KGB, a reminder that even the most watchful system can never defeat human ingenuity. For years, the Soviets denied it ever happened. They burned files, silenced witnesses, and rewrote reports to erase every trace of their failure. But in the cold corridors of Lubyanka, the KGB officers knew the truth. The Americans had been there, and they never saw them coming. Tony Mendez and his team returned home in silence. No medals, no speeches, no photographs, only the quiet certainty that they had won a battle. That would never appear in history books. For decades, their names remained sealed inside Langley's archives, marked with a single label, top secret. Only years later, when the Cold War had become a distant memory, the world learned that a handful of men and women had achieved the impossible, outsmarting the KGB on its own soil. Their legacy isn't measured in decorations or parades, but in the techniques, the courage, and the precision that redefined modern intelligence tradecraft. In a war of shadows, they were the ones who learned to walk within the darkness and to vanish before the shadow could reach them. If the Cold War was a chess game, this was the move no one saw coming. While the world watched missiles, speeches, and borders, the real battle was being fought in silence. Through forged passports, coded messages, and glances that spoke louder than words. Because in the war of information, victory doesn't belong to the strongest, but to the invisible. And that night in Moscow, as snow fell over a city that slept unaware, a small group of agents proved that even in the enemy's heart, fear doesn't see everything.